Found it. Igor, would you mind taking the first point?
Yes. So this came up in kind of a fireside chat that Stephanie, Matt, and I had a couple of days ago, where Matt and I had a pretty similar idea of how we thought multi-store works for migrating data, and Stephanie refuted both of us, and it doesn't work the way that we thought it works. So the mental model that I had was that we would have kind of a 4-phase rollout where we first write to the old data store and read from the old data store. Then we enable dual writes. So we read from old, we write to both. We kind of leave that running and warm things up. Then we switch the reads over. So we read from new, but still write to both. So we can sort of switch back whenever we want to. And then finally, we stop the dual writes. So that was my mental model. That's not how multi-store works at all. So the way that it actually works is you enable dual writes, and that will implicitly also enable reads from the new data store with a fallback to the old data store on not found. And so you have no way of enabling dual writes without reading directly from the new data store. And also you can't independently say where the reads are coming from. The reads will always go to new and then fall back to old, which is pretty surprising behavior, or at least it was to me. And this issue kind of talks through some of the consequences of this design, which I think for the original like initial migration, that made sense, and I think that was fine. But as we're sort of getting more latency sensitive and also more kind of consistency sensitive workloads, it may be time to rethink the design, and there's a few ideas outlined in the issue. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
I think it's mostly a historical thing. What was the first migration we did with the multi-store thing?
It might have been rate limiting, or it might have been what was the other one?
I think it was sessions from shared state.
Oh yeah.
Yes, sessions. Sessions was it. You're right.
In a typical migration, if there is such a thing, at what point, if we went with that different approach that you suggested, Igor, to kind of, I guess, manually decide when we start to read from new, what informs that decision? Like, at what point do we say, right now we want to start reading from new?
In this case, it would have been the TTL, I think. Like 8 hours. We had a TTL of 8 hours on that stuff, yeah. So I would wait 8 hours.
That's part of it. So general like warm-up period, and I guess generally speaking, sort of backfill of old data if we need to do that, right? So if we do like proactive migration of data, which for say persistent or shared state, we'll likely want to do something like that. But I think the other piece is in gaining confidence is to actually do some analysis on the data that was migrated. So you can sort of leave it running, and then you can snapshot both the old and new and kind of compare the data and say, is this a strict subset? Is there stuff missing? Is there stuff that's different where we would expect it to be the same? How bad is the drift, and is the drift something we need to worry about? So that's kind of an additional capability that I would like to have for future migrations and that we don't currently have.
It's
So
too bad.
you would read from old, and it would also check consistency in new. And then once you had 100% consistency, that would be an indication that you could do the switch over.
I think that part would be
Yeah,
manual,
pretty
wouldn't
much. Yeah, well, I don't know how well it can be automated. I think, yeah, we would need to kind of perform a snapshot of the data. So like RDB dump and then do comparisons on that, which can be scripted, but it's not going to be fully automated, yes.
It's too bad Jakob isn't here because he was mentioning moving multi-store into something that is configuration. So when we're working on this anyway, I think having the option to do to leave the reads where they are while having dual write is something we need to consider in that design.
Yeah, as in like it's a strategy. Like, is that what you're suggesting? Like you can choose which approach you take?
I think more flags, as in now start writing to both, like read 2 feature flags for reading, 2 feature flags for writing. I think would be how I'd do it now, and then it's up to the SRE how to use them. Don't shoot yourself in the foot, maybe.
Yeah, so if any of you have any more thoughts on this, please do leave them in the issue.
Now that you
Thanks.
mentioned it like that, I'm kind of surprised that wasn't the approach we went with. Like I was in the initial discussions, and then when I reviewed the merge request of the multi-store before it was ever used, I thought like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But now that you mentioned it otherwise, I think, oops.
Okay, Bob, you have the next one.
Yeah, so recently the data, I think Igor brought me into a discussion with the database team, and they were looking into a saturation point for like integers running out, like yeah, on the primary keys that have not a big int as their primary key, and they were working on that already, but they were surprised that we hadn't notified them that they were across the threshold that they had in their mind, because that's a saturation point that we do monitor in Tamland. And out of that, I restarted the work on using the soft SLO, so the soft threshold for capacity planning, and then leaving the hard threshold for only monitoring. Let me show you where I got. So here's what that saturation point looked like currently. Before, we would alert as soon as we forecast the date on the full red line, and I'm proposing to change that as soon as we forecast the date on the dotted line here, which is the soft SLO. In the merge requests that I linked here, I've noticed that that would create 30 something more, 31 new capacity planning issues. But I think that's just a trigger for us to set the thresholds correctly, because currently we've just used the hard SLO, which means we would create a capacity planning issue as soon as we think we might alert the SRE on call at some point in the future. But for a lot of saturation points, we want to start work before then. Specifically, the integer overflow one is months of work. So if the team had waited until we notified them, it would have been too late. So good on them for not waiting for us.
So is that the main problem that you're trying to solve here, is that some teams require more notice to be able to fix this?
Yes,
I'm trying to figure out what the problem is.
The thing is that it's coupled, that the thresholds are coupled. We have the alerting threshold that is going to page an SRE on call and they need to solve a problem right now, like especially for this one. And if we saturate here, there's going to be loads of hurt. And I don't know what the easy solution is. So the main thing that I want to fix is decouple the threshold that we set for, hey team, we've got this capacity planning issue. Tell us what you think needs doing, and the paging of an SRE on call.
I quite like what Andrew's written.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, those names are, you know, they're just, you can blame me for them, but they never really made a lot of sense, like hard and soft. Well, on the one hand, it makes sense to use both. I think it's a perfectly good change, but maybe we should just rename them to alerting threshold and capacity planning threshold, because then it's one less thing that people have to understand.
Think about
what correlation
the
is.
name.
Yeah.
The name can be transient from now on. Like, I didn't pin myself on the names. If we change it on one side, we just need to change 2 strings in Tamland as well.
But I think it's a perfectly reasonable change, like a good change actually that you made.
So alerting means the point at which the SRE gets paged.
Yes. Well, depending on the severity of the saturation point.
Yeah, okay. That sounds reasonable.
So
I mean, we definitely want to give people enough warning to deal with things when we know there's a problem coming.
So Bob, the current behavior before we change this to soft is that it projects when we would reach the alerting threshold 3 months in 3 months, right?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
With the 80% confidence.
So, yeah. So what that means is if we change this, we'll likely want to raise to avoid having those 81 or however many they were, 71 issues created. We want to raise the soft or the capacity planning thresholds to match basically the alerting ones for most of our services.
We need to, I think we need to go through some of those that have been set. So like just make a, because there's 31 issues, so 31 saturation points, maybe less because that could be issues separated by service. So we just need to go through them and see. I wouldn't change them all, but the ones that would create an issue, I don't think we should just blindly set them all to match, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks.
The next item is also mine. Yeah. Can you still share my screen? Because the thing shows a black screen here for me.
Well, share it and see what happens.
Because
when you shared your screen earlier, we could see it.
Yeah?
We see the agenda.
Okay, so this is the other thing. I just wanted to drop this here to get some ideas because Stephanie and I had a short call about this and we don't really have an idea yet. But what I've seen is some recordings. This is the wrong thing. Some recordings that we use to display on dashboard and so on. So global recordings that happen in Tunnel's ruler don't match their actual source metrics. And this is an example. So here I'm not using the error budget metrics here because I thought, yeah, I was just looking at something different, and this is what popped up. So the green line here is the component ops rate recorded in the separate Prometheuses. And then the monitor global one is what we actually end up displaying in places in dashboards. This is also the kind of recordings that we use for error budgets. So the problem happens there as well. And you can see these huge drops and they don't match what Prometheus recorded. And I was wondering if anybody had any idea. Like my current theory is some Prometheus is not responding or timing out or whatever, and we use partial response strategy warm, so we just ignore it. That's the theory.
Yeah, I'm sure it must be that, right? Like it would be surprising if it's not that. But you do get logs for that, hey?
Yes, but I haven't been able to correlate that because there's so much logs that these things are spitting out, and it's not super clear.
So, do you see? But do you Does the log not have the recording rule name in it that you could kind of filter it down by, perhaps?
What I've noticed is these logs come like in burst, and then it's a bunch of recording rules because like these drops specifically, I've also correlated to, in this case, the error budget recordings that also happen in tunnels.
So the theory is that this partial response happens during a recording rule scrape, and then we persist the bad data?
Yes.
Okay.
And there's one more that I... Go ahead, Andrew, go first.
Just before we go on, because I think it's a kind of important point. Like, if you go read the Thanos documentation, it very much says like only use the partial strategy if you know exactly what you're doing, and like you probably don't want to do this. And there's a lot of that kind of in the documentation, which is right. And when we were doing this, it was kind of like our choices are either error or warn. And if we had error, then kind of, because at least, if one Prometheus drops out, everything else still gets evaluated at the level at which it's at. It just kind of gets excluded, and it's better for us to still do the SLO evaluation rather than just not evaluating during that period. And so it was kind of like the least evil kind of option available to us.
Is it safe for us to because right now our runbooks prevent the static validation prevents us from not setting the partial response strategy. Would it be acceptable for you to for us to do that? Like, we need to specify it explicitly, warn or abort.
So the thing is that the problem is that if we had like one pre-Prometheus server, it doesn't even need to get any data on it, right? Like, it just has to be malfunctioning. It doesn't even have to have this particular data on it. One host out of hundreds, well, not hundreds, maybe many dozens, is out, then we don't get any metrics.
That brings me to the next thing I wanted to bring up. Can we separate Thanos ruler and run it per environment and have still the single Thanos query instance that we use to query all of the things?
And we have a whole Thanos stack per environment.
I think it's kind of handy to be able to query, like, a whole Thanos stack per environment is...
Yeah, maybe, but that's definitely a good first start. Like, if we can do that...
I don't know if we can do that. It's a question. I just brought it up yesterday because I broke Thanos. Like, that was my fault. But if I had stages to roll it out to pre-staging, and then I would have maybe caught it.
I mean, I'm sure because you can just configure it with the backends, I'm just looking here. With the query, you can give it a bunch of queries, right? So presumably
Thanos query doesn't care how many backends you give it.
Yeah, but Thanos rule, you give it a bunch of query backends, I think, don't you?
That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah.
And then there's also the sidecar.
I mean, it's worth investigating.
Okay, and short term.
So I have a question.
Yes?
Do you think that these problems have always been occurring and we just didn't notice it, like we weren't looking at it at this level? Or do you think something has happened recently that has made them,
I think
like it's tipped over the kind of point and it started these events?
I think this occurs more as we grow, as we gather more series. This happens more often. That's my theory.
But also, we should be investigating that. We should be making ourselves more immune to it, but we should also be investigating, because that's you know, if it was a pre-server, you wouldn't see much change, right? A pre-server or staging server would be a tiny little dip in the metric, doesn't matter. But that's a big chunk of data that's falling out, and that means that it's one of our proper servers from production that's now becoming invisible for a 5-minute period. So we should definitely investigate that as a separate issue.
Yeah. One other thing that this is not directly related to this, but this is a little bit how my understanding of recording rules works. Everything in a group gets evaluated at once, and we've separated the feature category metrics from the component ops ones, but both use the same, in some cases, SLI aggregation rules. Andrew probably knows what I'm talking about. I don't know if the others do. But those get recorded in a separate group. Would that also cause incorrectness? Andrew, you're muted, I think.
Sorry, I was thinking, like, I don't think that the group just kind of dictates the pace at which they run, because they always run in sequence inside a group, and then it goes back to the beginning and starts again. But I don't think if it fails like halfway through the group, I don't think it kind of short circuits the rest of the rules. Or is that what you're talking about?
Yes, it does. It does.
I mean,
If, like, either the whole group gets evaluated or nothing does, if I got it right.
I didn't think it was that smart.
I
might be wrong.
I did, like, that's why I separated the while back, I think a year ago, I separated the fast burning rules from the long burning ones, because then we had shorter evaluation times for rules.
Yeah. The evaluation times definitely, and obviously if say you've got it every 30, it's just a loop, right? It's basically a while loop, and then it, you know, if it's running every 5 minutes, then it will run, and it takes 3 minutes, and it will run for 3 minutes and it'll wait for 2 and it'll start again. But if it runs for 6 minutes, then it will just run, you know, over and over and over, because that's just how the loop works. If you get, but I don't think there's no atomicity to those groups.
Okay.
You know, then as far as I might be wrong on that, but I've never heard of that.
Follow-up question: what do you think about separating the recording rule registry rules per service? Like now we have recording rule.
When you say registry rules?
Yes. You remember when I talk about registry rules? The recording rule registry in the runbooks is like this thing that has the intermediate recording rules. Let me show it in code, perhaps. So here we've got this recording rule metrics stanza, and
those ones, the intermediate,
yes,
the intermediate one.
So for hard cardinality metrics like Rails request and HTTP and so on, we have those intermediate rules that then get dropped in here. These are these rules.
Yeah.
SLI aggregation rules.
Yeah.
And those are then the ones that we use for further down the line. So they don't have
so the
alt
reason,
labels and
the reason that's very specifically in the same group, so that you don't use stale data, because the order in which they're evaluated is always from top to bottom. And so, you know, if they were on 2 separate loops, the one, you know, they could be kind of off kilter from one another, where that one is being evaluated immediately after the thing that uses it, and then you're always getting data that's 1 minute further out of date. So having them in that order kind of prevents that.
Yes, but that was actually my question. So for the feature category metrics, we use those same aggregations,
Oh yeah,
but they're not in the
yeah.
same
So those
group.
those are actually, yeah, they're not in the same group. So they, so those ones could be staggered, like, and actually delayed, which is not necessarily good. It obviously, the longer period that you're expecting to use them, the less that's a problem. Like if this you're using to evaluate over a 30-day period, then 1 minute delay on your metrics doesn't make any difference. But if you're using it to alert on immediate issues, then it can be a problem.
I think because we use these things in ratios. So if the top side is there but the bottom side isn't, you get these weird things.
Yeah.
But
right, you get jaggers, you got jaggies.
I'm going to because it worked before, and like now we're looking into it, and I noticed this, so I'm going to postpone that for a while. Another question that I had here, we have these aggregations in Prometheus, and they have a type label in their aggregation. This means if you specify a type label in the aggregation and no selector, so that means if you specify HTTP request total here, that's going to record for all services, and it's going to use that recording rule for all services.
Yeah.
Was that intentional or not?
I have a vague recollection that we were hand rolling those when we first started doing it, and we shared those intermediate ones between API, web, and I might be wrong on this. And
no, they are shared now.
They are shared.
Yes.
Yeah. So then, but then you obviously don't get the
advantage. Here you've got the HTTP request total one isn't going to be here, so you don't get the advantage that you just said that they're in the same group.
Yeah. So there you've got that same. I mean, the only other thing you can do is just maybe double the speed at which you evaluate the intermediate ones, and kind of hope for the best. You still get the problem to some degree, but you can kind of just increase the frequency.
I think my first thought would be like limit these that we drop here to the service. So here we'd add
right, and then line them, and then always inline them.
Yes, so then here we'd have the selector.
So the question then is, how many different places are they being used?
Well, like that becomes easy to see.
Then the question is, do we even need the intermediates, or do we just get rid of the intermediates? Like if it's being used in 2 places and it's being recorded, it's probably not worth the extra overhead, and then we just inline it.
I think that would be awesome if we didn't need them, but I have no way to safely try that out yet.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, you can turn them. I think there's like a flag you could turn them off. So if you're feeling adventurous, you could turn it off briefly and see how. I mean, I think that the first thing we need to do is kind of make sure that Thanos Ruler in particular is firing on all cylinders, and not like my car. And then maybe we also, if you could scale Ruler up horizontally, or there's various different ways that we could do it. Like, do we even know the health of that Ruler instance? Like, is it just totally maxed out? Like, unable
yesterday
to keep up?
Yesterday I maxed it out like really hard.
But it is I mean, if you look at the documentation, they say you can scale these things horizontally. So, have we just got one because it was the default, and it's something we should be thinking about, and then get rid of all this complexity around these intermediate recording rules and the jaggies that they give us and all of that stuff. And just instead of having one Thanos ruler, we have 100 Thanos rulers, and we don't even have a problem anymore.
That sounds awesome. I want that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Stop.
Because the cognitive overhead of all of that is like it's really complicated, especially when you're trying to get back to the source metric. Sorry, Igor, you said something and I missed it.
I was going to say we have a similar issue with Thanos Compact as well, where we kind of want to scale that out if possible. So if we're going to think about how to structure one of the sort of monolithic Thanos components, we can maybe think about it in a bit of a broader way as well.
There's a team that owns that stuff now, and I think there's some work to change it from what's that thing to Helm. So kind of bringing it in line with how everyone else does it, and maybe now is a good time to start engaging with them and saying like, hey, we want to scale this out, and anyway.
Igor, you have the next point. Have I stopped sharing?
Yes, you have.
Okay.
So the next item is something that Jakob brought up, which is related to how we manage our Redis and in particular our Sentinel configs on VMs. So those configurations are chef managed, and that means every time we run a reconfigure, it'll completely nuke that config file and like rewrite it. And so we start up with a fresh state. One of the really weird design decisions in Redis Sentinel is that it stores its own state in its config file. And so we kind of get away with this because we only do one of these at a time. We try very hard to coordinate these reconfigures. And so we sort of get to repopulate the state. But there's certain edge cases where if we were to nuke it on multiple Sentinels at the same time, then we would get in a really bad state. And Jakob built a test case for this, which I am going to share now. So this test case has 2 Redises and 3 Sentinels, and it starts the Sentinels off with an empty config. And the master in the Sentinel line is mismatched with who is actually the master, as in which Redis does not have a replica of line in its config. And so I'm going to run this, and so it's going to take a few seconds to start up. We can see the 3 Sentinels, and let's see, hopefully this is going to reproduce the issue that I saw previously. So yeah, Sentinels take a bit to kind of converge, but now we've got the Sentinels don't detect the current state and say, we have 1 master and 1 replica, this is fine. Instead, they say, oh, well, we have a master, but it's not the one I thought it should be. That one is actually a replica. Let me perform a failover, but it can't do a failover because it doesn't know about the replicas. So part of the state that Sentinel stores is known Sentinels and known replicas. And in this case, my suspicion is that because it doesn't have any known replicas, it can't do the failover. So what I changed in this test case is to actually write those known replica and known Sentinel lines to the config file. And basically that's sort of the proposed change to how we manage our Sentinel configs. And so we can see how that changes the behavior under this specific case. And hopefully it's going to go a little better and not leave us in a state where the cluster is broken, right? Like this situation is bad. We don't have a working Redis setup. So let's, I've checked out this new branch, which writes those configs to the sentinel.conf file. And so let's see what happens. And this is also logging Redis log lines. So it's a little more verbose than the example that we had previously. So we have a primary and we have a replica. And so let's see what happened. So again, Sentinel decides, okay, we should perform a failover. But this time it actually successfully performs the failover. So there's promotion, and let's see if yes. And so now we get into a really strange state where we've promoted Redis 2, but Redis 1, or I think we've promoted Redis 1, but then one of the sentinels tries to reconfigure Redis 1 to be a replica of itself. And so we get into this weird state where it's like, I'm trying to connect to myself, but for some reason I can't. And it keeps doing this for like 10, 20 seconds. At which point the sentinels realize that there's no primary and will initiate another failover. And so they perform that failover, at which point we have a primary, but Redis 1 is still trying to connect to itself. So we can see the thing. Yes, so it's still trying to connect to itself. So this loop is still ongoing, right? And then eventually, it takes about a minute for this. Sentinel realizes, oh, we have this node that is trying to connect to itself. That shouldn't be happening. It should be a replica of this other node. And so it does this fix replica config command. And now we're finally in a stable state. So it's super weird and it's not ideal, but it does eventually converge. So I would argue that this is probably better than where we were previously. But it's still kind of scary that Redis has these weird edge cases.
Yeah, it reminds me of every time I see people using like a chef template to manage their Sentinel config, and you know that it's going to end in. I think the GitLab main chef one does that, doesn't it? It's not. It's not
yes,
a good one.
That's the one we use. We use Omnibus.
Yeah, which is terrifying.
And we get around it by
Yes.
disabling chef, if I got it right.
Pretty much. I mean, we disable reconfigures in Chef, and we run them very rarely, which is also not great for other reasons. Yeah,
You
but
can
I think
almost make
with
a chef recipe that's specific, that does Sentinel. It doesn't use just a template and blat it. Sorry,
you mean instead of using Omnibus?
Well, kind of in Omnibus, like actually have a specialist task, or for where you can say, make sure that this Sentinel's in and this Sentinel's not in there, but like don't mess with the epoch, don't mess with the it's much more sort of
Okay,
sensitive to
yeah.
the way that, but That's like
So do a
Oh.
config file parse and rewrite as opposed to a full replace.
yeah, blat, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think full replace with those sensitive lines added in will likely get us pretty close. So I think that's my proposal. But I'm happy to hear other ideas there as well.
Would you upstream that into Omnibus?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so. I mean,
Yeah, so
long term,
benefit.
we probably want to move this to Kubernetes, hopefully. The Bitnami Redis Helm chart actually does what I'm proposing to add to Omnibus. So there is some prior art there as well.
Really interesting. Awesome.
All
You'll
right.
probably find that we'll need to actually put out a thing to like a bunch of GitLab administrators to say, it might be safe to turn on reconfigure on your Redis nodes now. Because you probably find there's many GitLab administrators who've turned it off for the same reason.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Sentinel isn't even that widely used by self-managed. I don't know, actually.
Difficult to know, but yeah.
Cool. That's all I had. Thanks. We're at the end of the agenda.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for the great chat. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye bye.
Bye.